Hi, I'm Dr. Shiloh.
And I'm Dr. Scott.
And this is LA Not So Confidential, the forensic psychology and true crime podcast.
Each week, we explore the intersection of psychology, the criminal justice system, and entertainment.
Today, our episode is an update on a previous forensic psych topic, Folie. Deux.
Welcome back, everybody. So this is kind of rare. I mean, we don't do this very often with the couple of hundred episodes that we have under our belt. We've really only done a couple of sort of revisited, updated. Right. Stockholm Syndrome was certainly one, and we did that one really quick because right after we released that episode, a lot more information came out, right? So we jumped into doing that. But
and
this is one
where we did last year, which we had to divide up the revisited episode into two parts. It was so much.
Yeah, so much information on that, which after there had been just sort of this absolute absence of any kind of research. And now we have researchers and mental health professionals and criminologists from all over the world realizing like, oh, there's a potential mass event, terrorist threat, basically homegrown terrorist threat with that. This one for today, there's not a lot more research, but I convinced Dr. Shiloh to let us do this episode because there are three cases that we're covering today that have popped up that I feel clinically very certain that Folie Deux plays an important role. One of them is already clear. The other two are actually a little bit more recent, which, as most of our listeners know, we don't necessarily always talk about the most recent things happening unless they're being adjudicated.
Right.
Or they've already been adjudicated like very recently. And so clearly all of these cases today, that's exactly what's happened. But before we go any further, Dr. Shiloh, can you give us a recap on our last episode?
Sure. So that was episode 184, and we tackled case studies and the psychological motivations for the growing presence of extremism within U.S. military and law enforcement. And we explored all the available research, which wasn't a ton. It's getting there, though, as well as some of the most notorious examples of extremists in the U.S. So if you haven't had a chance to listen, please take time when you can, because it's a very important topic. And I think for today, I appreciate that we do these follow-ups. I mean, other stuff comes out, topics are out there, cases are out there that people want to know about. And as good clinicians and people who want to stay up on the research side of things, I think it's cool to take our audience on this journey as well, because sometimes these topics need to be revisited. So you can't just let them drop off, episodes ago.
In combination with the case examples, sort of light case studies that we'll be presenting today, we'll wrap up with how clinically I'm concerned about how Folie Deux, shared madness, mass hysteria, mass delusion is actually a big part of how big movements happen in the world. And it feels very relevant to what's going on in our world at this time. So, but we're going to be going over some terms, maybe even building on what we already shared with you last time in the previous Folie Deux episode, but this time with even more information. So, going back to a basic definition, Folie Deux is also known as shared psychotic disorder. The translation into English is madness of two, Folie Deux. It involves the sharing or the transmission of delusions, both bizarre and non-bizarre. More on that in a bit. From one individual who's known as the primary or inducer to another individual who's known as the secondary or the acceptor. And while examples of Folie Deux have emerged in popular culture over the past couple of decades, the condition can extend even further to involve more individuals, becoming folie à trois, folie à quatre, or even mass hysteria, folie à plusieurs. The diagnosis was included exclusively in the DSM-4, but has since been subsumed and incorporated in other diagnoses under DSM-5, which, I mean, there's some benefit to that, like not sort of over drilling down into things, because this absolutely does fall under the broad category of psychosis and delusion.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's totally acceptable. It doesn't feel like something that had to be parsed out. It can just be simply like a notation since it's falling under that same category. But for today, we do have some trigger warnings for you. We're going to have some details of violence and murder, child perpetrated murder, as well as child abuse and emotional abuse. So please listen with care because we cover a lot. I think there's also a lot of themes of high religiosity today, which I believe last time we kind of talked about this topic in roundabout ways in different episodes. We always like to give you some of those warnings as well. All right. In our original episode, which was episode 28. I cannot believe that it was eons ago like that. And that was just on Folie, Deux. We covered several examples of crimes committed by individuals with these diagnoses. And while we're not going to cover these again in depth, I think it's worth re-listening to or even reading more into these cases. And there's a lot out there. So, of course, we touched on the Swedish twins. They were Ursula and Sabina Eriksson. Incredible story with incredible video footage that you can watch. And we also talked about Heaven's Gate, and that was all set into motion by Marshall Applewhite and Bonnie Nettles, which moved from, of course, Folie Deux into mass delusion with the cult Heaven's Gate. So with that, I think this week's episode, we are going to discuss recent developments and some other cases that we have maybe touched on before. So we have the Slenderman case, the attempted murder case there, the sentencing, very recent sentencing of Chad Daybed, and the charges against Ruby Franke and how that case panned out. But I really like how we set this up today in terms of having some cases, putting in some research, putting in some reminders in between. So let's start with Slenderman.
So Slenderman has been fascinating to me from years ago. This is something that happened over a decade ago. It is a fascinating case of Folie Deux, but also in children, which is what really makes it fascinating from an academic standpoint and disturbing from sort of a cultural standpoint, because we don't expect children to be capable of such violence. And I think that our culture really doesn't want to look at the possibility of children being ill as well, because that makes us uncomfortable as parents, as people who care about our children, right? So we covered this case, the Slenderman attempted murder, back in 2019 pretty extensively. And I'm going to give you a background and reorient you to this event. On May 31st in 2014, literally 10 years ago, to, within a month of now, in Waukesha, Wisconsin, two 12-year-old girls, Anissa Wire and Morgan Geyser, lured their friend Peyton Leutner to a wooded area of a local park, and they stabbed her 19 times. They did this to appease the fictional character of Slenderman. Slenderman is a fictional character created on the online forum Something Awful for a 2009 paranormal image photo contest. It was then also used to develop the mythology on a website called Creepypasta, which is an amateur wannabe professional writing website. There's some absolutely wonderful horror that is done there on that site. The idea is that you think of an idea and you write it in first person as if it was your experience. And then other members of the Creepypasta website jump in and expand on that character's myth. With Slenderman, the myth was immediately explosive and expanded through fan fiction and tons of really wonderful and terrifying visual arts. Slenderman is depicted as an unnaturally tall and thin, emaciated figure with a white, featureless face, dressed in a black suit. Sometimes he's shown with tentacles growing from his back, and in these stories, he causes amnesia, coughing fits, and paranoia, and he's often seen lurking in forests. So if you haven't seen it, it's very easy to find. There's been a movie made about it, but think about The Nightmare Before Christmas's Jack Skellington without a face, and much, much more horrifying. More recently, drawings of him have included those tentacles because some of the amateur writers are trying to incorporate Slenderman into sort of this H.P. Lovecraft Cthulhu mythos. I mean, I know that's very specific and nerdy on my part, but practically every dude at some point from middle school into high school has been into H.P. Lovecraft's sort of huge hulking horror.
Well, and every year during Halloween at the Halloween stores, I still see Slenderman costumes are out there.
Which is crazy. So this attack happened during a game, allegedly, of hide and seek in a nearby heavily wooded park area there in Waukesha. Wire and Geyser pinned down Peyton Leutner and stabbed her in the arms, legs, and torso with a 5-inch blade. 2 of those wounds hit her major organs, narrowly missing a major artery and cutting through her diaphragm into her liver and stomach. After that attack, Leutner was thought to be dead, but she managed to drag herself to a nearby road where a cyclist found her and called for help. What's fascinating about this particular event, it was a wild coincidence.
Yep.
This cyclist never used this path. He came forward and said, I just, for some reason, thought today I'll take an unused path. I'll take one that I'm not really familiar with. Very, very wonderful coincidence that happened and ended up saving her life because surgeons worked for 6 hours to repair those critical injuries to her organs and surrounding tissue.
5 hours after the attack, Wire and Geyser were apprehended near a furniture store about 5 miles from the crime scene. They were still carrying the knife used in the stabbing and claimed that they were on their way to meet Slenderman in the Nicollet National Forest. Wire and Geyser, when they were found walking along that road, they were picked up by police and went on to inform investigators about their intent to appease Slenderman. So during interrogations, Geyser displayed no empathy whatsoever, while Wire did show some guilt. Both believed that the attack was necessary to please Slenderman. Geyser later revealed that she had experienced lifelong hallucinations. She was diagnosed with early onset childhood schizophrenia and was treated with antipsychotic medication. Both girls were charged with first-degree intentional homicide and tried as adults. If everyone remembers, that was a really big deal when this was happening. Are they going to be tried as adults or not? And indeed, they were. So Wire pleaded guilty to being a party to attempted second-degree homicide and was found not guilty by reason of mental disease. And then Geyser also pleaded guilty and was similarly found not guilty by reason of mental disease due to her schizophrenia diagnosis. So isn't that interesting that at least in Wisconsin, you plead guilty first and then the court can find you not guilty by reason of mental disease?
I think it's indicated in the research. Well, I'm clear because I was just reading it. Maybe I didn't write that particularly clearly, is that she was offered a plea deal after she agreed to plead guilty. So it's almost like like maybe an Alford. I mean, it's not exactly like an Alford, but an Alford plea is that you're going to admit that we have enough evidence to find you guilty.
Sure.
But we can't, so we're going to let you off. I mean,
yeah, that makes sense.
It's very interesting that there's so many options in this particular way.
Yeah, for sure. So Wire was sentenced to 25 years to life, requiring at least 3 years of confinement and treatment in a psychiatric institution, then followed by supervision until she's age 37, whereas Geyser received the maximum sentence of 40 years to life, requiring at least 3 years of confinement and psychiatric treatment until symptoms resolve or until the age 53.
So at the time of their arrest, Anissa told police that she was conflicted about trying to kill their friend Peyton. She's quoted as saying, "The bad part of me wanted her to die, but the good part of me wanted her to live." Morgan, she says, convinced her that the attack would prompt Slenderman to take them to his mansion in a neighboring forest. Morgan said, "Slender, if you're listening, please help us." And he didn't do anything. Nothing happened. So the attack sparked a lot of debates about the influence of the internet on children, understandably. The Waukesha School District went on to block the Creepypasta Wiki, where Slenderman's lore was very popular. The Slenderman's creators, and one creator in particular, expressed condolences. And then the creepypasta community went on to raise a great deal of money for Leutner. Wisconsin officials held events to support the victim, and she publicly spoke about her experience in 2019, expressing a desire to pursue a career in medicine because she was so inspired by her doctor through this ordeal. This case really highlighted at that time the need for parental monitoring of children's internet use to protect them from harmful influences. Wire was released from the Winnebago Mental Health Institute in September 2021 after more than 4 years of inpatient psychiatric treatment. She is required to reside with her father, with her internet use monitored and under a 24/7 GPS tracking system. In April 2024, a judge denied Geyser's petition for early release following psychologist recommendations for continued inpatient care. That is very significant, by the way.
Very clear,
When
yeah.
you have clinicians that are making those kind of recommendations, what they're saying is that there has been actually very little insight developed.
Yeah, yeah. Well, after all of this, Leutner was hospitalized for 10 days. Of course, she underwent that extensive medical treatment and rehabilitation. She did return to school that September in 2014 and excelled academically while volunteering and participating in school activities. And then in that 2019 interview, she really expressed gratitude for her experience, stating that it helped shape her and her future. I mean, talk about post-traumatic growth. If she's taking this and pursuing a career in medicine, I mean, I would love to know, that was 5 years ago, that interview, where she's at now. But of course, she deserves her privacy and she can let us know where she's at when and if she wants to.
Yeah, and this is also because this is in the news so recently. I mean, like we were saying, just last month, May, I can only imagine that she may be having a number of emotional reactions to what's going on, including some very healthy ones and maybe some challenging ones. So we absolutely wish her well and her support system. And, if you're a friend or a supporter of Miss Leutner, then, keep doing it. That can be a triggering time.
Indeed. Indeed. So just to recap here, we're going to talk about delusional disorder. I know we literally just did this in the last episode. We talked about Carl Tanzler, but not everyone listens to our episodes in order. These are standalone episodes mostly. So we're going to review this so it's captured in this particular topic, as well as in a moment, we'll drill down and just give you a little bit more on psychosis in children, because obviously that harkens back to the Slenderman case and why you, as well as so many other people, found it so interesting. So delusional disorder is the very foundational issue of Folie, Deux, and are a major, major piece of that. Delusions are fixed and unchanging beliefs that remain impervious to reason, even when faced with conflicting evidence. So I think we've used several different examples before. A bizarre delusion is one that are really far-fetched and improbable, and most importantly, not understood by those within the same culture. An example is believing, again, that aliens removed and replaced one's body parts without any evidence, right? Just something super wild and out there. A non-bizarre delusion, these are situations that could be possible, like believing one is being monitored through their computer or being followed, or even something like being poisoned. Could happen, right? Probable.
It could happen, and things like that have happened.
Of course. And then you get looped into like, am I going to talk about something that no one's going to believe me, but it actually is happening, right? I mean, those are such one-off cases, and that's kind of like my worst nightmare, those Twilight Zones where you're trying to explain to people what's going on. They all think you're insane. But as we've touched on different psychotic and delusional disorders, that's been interesting to reflect on those people's experiences, like Capgras syndrome and, of course, gang stalking and things like that. But Folie, Deux characteristics have specific characteristics that emerge from that foundation of delusion. So in Folie, Deux, the delusions of the primary person are adopted or internalized by that secondary individual. What the research and analysis of these cases has revealed is that it typically occurs in relationships where one person is the more dominant personality and the other is dependent or experiences a deep drive to be understood and validated, and that primary person then meets that need for them.
So in the past, delusional disorder was, I guess the way to picture it is that it was understood through very early and usually completely inadequate psychiatric theories that had really no knowledge about the brain's biological and social factors. But during the late 1800s and early 1900s, there were psychiatrists like Emil Kraepelin and Eugen Bleuler that included delusions as part of a broader category of mental illnesses like schizophrenia. They didn't see delusional order as a separate condition. They completely lumped it into schizophrenia. Treatments back then were basic and often involved keeping patients in institutions with little effort to address the delusions themselves. It was basically just warehousing and keeping the person hospitalized or incarcerated to prevent danger to themselves, to prevent danger to others, or maybe just they're getting paid off by the families. Who knows?
Right.
A lot of this stuff is actually lost to history. But today, we do recognize delusional disorder as its own very specific mental health condition. Again, it involves having one or more non-bizarre delusions that last at least for a month. I don't know if we really talk about this a lot. In all of our episodes, we talk about diagnoses, we talk about symptoms, we talk about behaviors, and maybe we haven't really talked or explained enough that for someone to have these diagnoses, they have to last and be chronic, severe, ongoing for a specific amount of time at bare minimum. So the non-bizarre delusions in delusional disorder have to last for at least a month. Now, what's great in the past 100 years is what we have available to us now is these advanced brain imaging techniques that found really significant differences in brain areas like the prefrontal cortex. And that area is really, really specifically important for decision making and controlling emotions. So there are additional cognitive behavioral theories that suggest that people with delusional disorder have trouble evaluating reality in an accurate way. And that is very, very interesting. A lot of people just sort of these days, we have so many different theoretical orientations that it's easy to sort of poo-poo cognitive or behavioral therapies because they actually are separate themselves, but they've been lumped together for years. Cognitive behavioral has sort of been this overarching term. But the idea of drilling down into the idea that someone has trouble or challenges evaluating their own reality in an accurate manner or an objective manner spreads out from delusional disorder to all sorts of personality disorders. Individuals with narcissistic personality disorder or antisocial personality disorder or borderline personality disorder, as well as the others, have a real challenge in understanding that they're not the only person in the world, that they're not a victim, that they are unable to evaluate reality as well. But it's also important to remember that delusional disorder does not include auditory, visual, olfactory, or tactile hallucinations. So they don't hear things that aren't there. They don't see things that aren't there. They don't smell or physically feel things that are not there, but the interpretation of data and experience of their surroundings is very, very distorted. So the treatments now have these second and third generation antipsychotic medications, which are really getting better every few years with less side effects. That's part of the medication therapy, then along with a psychological therapy and support systems that help individuals with this manage their symptoms and improve their quality of life.
Right. So isolation, stress, and close relationships are also contributing factors. An annoying example from Wikipedia is still pretty sexist and limited in scope. It says that women with above average IQs and dependent expressive aspects of several different personality disorders are more susceptible to becoming secondary cases, which has not been borne out in the research literature. So interestingly, while isolation can be a factor in delusional disorder, we know that enmeshed relationships can definitely also be a factor in folie à deux. I mean, that's the whole precipice of these folks being too close and in a way in which their thought patterns start crossing over.
Yeah, that one particularly perturbs me because if you think about it, I mean, a great example in media representation, which actually was a really great movie and really great performance, is Michael Shannon and Ashley Judd in Bug. I mean, it's so good, but
Yeah.
it is one of the things that kind of makes you wonder. You're looking at her as a character and you're thinking, why are you falling for this? Like, why does he have this power over you? So I think that we have to be really careful about how sexist of a lens we are
Sure.
looking through this. Maybe there is some statistical validity to it, but it's not really completely borne out in the research that I was able to find. If we're able
Right.
to find some others, we'll post it as soon as we get it. So the onset of psychosis symptoms before the age of 12 is very rare, and it occurs less than 1/60th as often in adults. But studying early cases is really important for understanding the disorder and understanding these kind of rare circumstances, especially when it ends in criminal behavior, like in the Slenderman case. Many, many times there are giveaway symptoms and telltale behaviors in children that would be important to note. And you don't want to overanalyze or overdiagnose your child. And kids are quirky and weird and funny and
Yeah.
hilarious and dark. You know, it's always
Right.
great when you meet a kid that just looks like Damien or Esther from Orphan. You know, when they're really not
Yeah.
that way. That's just the way they're presenting. Like, remember Sydney? Remember how flat affect Sydney was for like 4 years? It was crazy, right?
Yeah, it's just because she's mimicking her father all the time.
Exactly.
But you're right. I mean, this is hard because a lot of these potential warning signs early on that you're going to talk about could be indicators of totally different
Completely
disorders
different
too.
things.
So
Yeah,
being a
absolutely.
parent just is so hard. Don't listen to this and diagnose your children, please.
Right. But I will say that one of the things that is very important is, thankfully, it's very, very rare in really, really young children. So elementary school children who are first, second, or third grade that may actually still have imaginary friends, that's not unusual. Like, they have some insight into
Right.
it, but they're kind of playing with autonomy and playing with the idea of having an imaginary friend. And maybe they're even, now that they realize they're a completely separate and differentiated person from their parents, they enjoy kind of seeing how the parents react to them making these kind of statements. So what gets difficult is, how do you parse that out from a child actually believing that they're seeing things that aren't there, or that they're believing some very, very odd things? So children may not openly admit to these problems unless they're prompted. So on one hand, we're telling you not to be too hypervigilant, but on the other hand, I'm telling you that recognizing
Right.
early warning signs and providing support during this time is really, really crucial. One of the things that does make it a little bit easier, if there are significant indicators of something like schizophrenia, is that the child will exhibit delays in language or other types of functions way beyond the psychotic symptom emergence. About 30% of children will display transient, which means non-permanent symptoms of pervasive developmental disorder. So some behaviors like that are physical that we would later recognize to be on the ASD spectrum, like rocking, posturing, arm flapping, and childhood onset psychosis can also sometimes be characterized by poor motor development. So if your kid is consistently behind these accepted markers, and again, let me say that again, consistently behind. It's
Right.
completely usual to be flexible back and forth in development. But like things like unusual crawling or a really significantly higher tendency to be anxious and disruptive when compared to those of a later onset, and there's not a reason for it. Like, if you're raising children in a very highly chaotic home and one kid is overly anxious, well, there's a reason for it, right?
Sure. Yeah.
But if there's no reason for it, then you want to be more aware. Again, and just like the onset of anything that is sudden, like a sudden change in thoughts, behaviors, it's important to remember that it's the emergence of several symptoms, not just one, that would indicate a problem that would require some attention and maybe even an assessment if that's possible. But like any kids, the behavior of kids with disorders can change over time, right? So psychosis can develop gradually or suddenly. We live in a very, very stressful time. So stress is a trigger to underlying genetic predisposition for mental illness. And it's important to look for children or adolescents that start beginning strange, unusual fears or very, very strange ideas. The kids may become more clingy towards parents or just say things that don't make sense at all. Another big one is if there's a marked change in the child's ability to enjoy socialization, like if the kid is actually hitting all these markers and getting along with kids and his own social group and his family members, and then it just stops and it moves into becoming extremely shy or withdrawn, or that they're lost in their own world, then that becomes problematic. So, Dr. Shiloh, let's move on to our next case example, which then now moves from an example of children experiencing shared psychosis to adults.
Yes, absolutely. So last year in Utah, a 12-year-old boy covered in open wounds knocked on a neighbor's door asking for food and water. He told the neighbor that he had escaped from a nearby home, climbing out of a window and running away. The neighbor immediately noted that the child was emaciated with a disheveled appearance and the remnants of duct tape used for restraint still on his ankles. The child was taken to the hospital and noted to be experiencing significant malnourishment and deep lacerations from being tied up with rope and tape. With the information gained from the child about his home address and what he was experiencing at the hands of his mother, 4 additional children were then taken into custody and emergency care. And Ruby Franke, a social media parenting influencer and mother of 6, was arrested and charged with 6 counts of felony abuse. So this is a very interesting case, one I didn't follow very closely, even though it was everywhere and as it should be. And I feel like a case that got wrapped up relatively quickly. I mean, I think probably the defendants just saw the writing on the wall here, but it's interesting to look at how this progressed. So a lot of details started emerging, both from her social media content as well as from journals that were recovered by investigators. And it really showed how her behaviors moved from a parenting style, I guess, into child abuse and then into torture, essentially. And after her arrest in 2023, this all came to light. It was discovered that Franke had been in an increasingly intense relationship with a Mormon marriage and family therapist named Jody Hildebrandt. Hildebrandt appears to have significantly influenced Franke's escalating behaviors in terms of her parenting. Franke's journal was astonishing, to say the least, as it became a really valuable piece of evidence, which showed both Franke's and Hildebrandt's delusional belief system essentially coming to life for the court. Her statement, "I will not feed a demon," became the dominant theme in the details of torturing her children. And the journal decisively outlines the quote unquote training process that resulted in the torture and abuse of Franke's 2 youngest children.
So the writings included dozens of pagers that were written by Franke starting in the middle of May 2023, when she brought her 2 youngest children to live with Hildebrandt in a remote, very affluent area of Ivins, Utah. And over the course of more than 3 months, Franke outlined the quote unquote training program that she was implementing with the intent to remove the quote unquote evil from her 9-year-old daughter and 12-year-old son, whom Franke describes as, quote unquote, the spawns of Satan. It's just, there's so much to unpack here, right in that bit right there. The final journal entry was dated on or about August 25th, which was 5 days before the pair was arrested. At that time, Franke wrote that both of her children were still defiant and out of control as the girl continued to scream and scream. And in her final entries in the journal, Franke described her role as a mother by writing that her 2 youngest children were sent to her because of the powerful intervention she was performing upon the possessed. She's quoted as saying, "God knew I would take my responsibility to mother them seriously." So by the time that the older child climbed out of a window and ran to the house of a neighbor who called police, both children had been kept in isolation and neither had seen the other in more than a month. Inside of a panic room at the home, Detectives found ropes and handcuffs used to bind the older child while the younger child was still bound when officers found her in a locked, dark closet. I want to say also, I mean, Dr. Shiloh, you were saying that you haven't been following this one. This one to me is incredibly disturbing, not just for Miss Franke's presentation. Ms. Hildebrandt represents the absolute worst of our profession.
Of course.
The absolute worst of our profession. I was riffing on this with you before we started recording. Even this kind of shit pisses me off to no end. I want to, and for all the listeners out there, I'm sharing with you what my shortcomings are. I wish I could be more even toned about this. This is the kind of thing that makes me want to dig a little bit deeper, find out where Hildebrandt went to school, and go to that master's program and hold them accountable for, you didn't screen, nobody saw any of this in her trainee sites. And I get it, like the mental health training for master's level and doctoral level, MFTs, psychologists, any of the professions, it's basically catch as catch can across the US. And it's not a good system. Sometimes you can get fantastic training. Sometimes you get nothing. When you get no training, when you get no supervision, and somebody's just signing off on your hours, then you get to be the own kind of crazy that you want to be.
Well,
and this is unfortunately what happened.
What, you know, when you say screening, you know, nobody would have known any of my crazy if I had it in my background as far as religious beliefs or anything like that. But I think, you know, the point you're trying to make, and I get why you get fired up about this and relate to it, because you are a licensed MFT as well. I mean, so you relate to her on that level and what her credentials are. But I think you're absolutely right. It's in the behaviors and the way in which you see clinicians or early career clinicians and trainees start to interact with their clients. And there has to be good supervision there. I mean, however it's done, whether it's through case consultation. And when we say supervision, meaning like you are having hour-long conversations at least once a week with your supervisor who's going over your cases and talking about your thinking and what your interventions are.
Supervision is not experiencing supervision as a young clinician. I mean, as an early career clinician is not always a pleasant experience, nor should it be. You should be held to, you know, I remember getting a steely glance from one wonderful supervisor who said, okay, lead me through your decision process on that intervention. And
then you're like, oh God.
And I was like, oh man, I really screwed up. And it's valuable to have that. But if it's within a closed echo chamber of a system, which may very well have been existing where Hildebrandt got her training. I will say this also is really creepy for anybody that has been following this. There's body cam footage when the police get to Hildebrandt's McMansion. And it is like a typical McMansion with like really over the top bad design, like, you know, 14-foot ceilings in this ultra modern house with a ridiculously huge front door. I mean, it's just crazy. And then they go in and there's barely any furniture. Like there's like, did she just move there or whatever? And then it just gets progressively worse. And you see the handcuffs and you see the restraints and the duct tape. It's super disturbing.
Hard to watch. I mean, very reminiscent of the Turpin case. And in both of these cases, I mean, the children are incredibly lucky to be alive. I mean, and in both cases, a child escaped and alerted authorities. Imagine the terror and that you know was going through those kids and the bravery it took for what they had been experiencing to take that risk. So
well, yeah, and the Ring camera footage of that son when he was able to get out of the house and get to a neighbor's house, it's not very well lit because it's typical, like certainly in a warm environment where the porch is actually heavily shaded. So there's not a lot of light there during the day. So everything seems to be kind of backlit from the ambient outdoor daytime light into that sort of shadowed porch area. So what you can see when this kid walks up is the light from behind him, and you see that his legs are as big around as sticks. Like it is emaciation that you're witnessing. This is not a healthy 12-year-old at all. Heartbreaking, absolutely heartbreaking.
So Ruby Frank had quite the social media presence and had even created a YouTube channel entitled 8 Passengers. Her channel initially was not very different from the typical and growing trend of Mormon mommy parenting and lifestyle influencers. Her parenting style had been called strict many times by critics, but, from what we've already talked about here, we're going to go out on a limb and say that it was just batshit crazy at times. I mean, purely authoritarian rather than authoritative. Within months, however, the videos being produced by Frank grew increasingly more and more bizarre, with her initiating a very black and white token economy with her kids. Now, token economies can be very helpful when trying to modify disruptive behavior patterns in children or even to teach more pro-social and healthy habits. But in Frank's 8-passenger videos, Frank's rules become more and more rigid and strangely arbitrary, such as when she told her sons that they would lose the privilege to eat dinner if they continued just play fighting, or when she said her 6-year-old needed to go hungry for forgetting to take her lunch to school. So while these as separate incidents would seem potentially relatively harmless, again, her authoritarian methods, even though controversial, did end up attracting a large audience.
And that is the problem with social media, is that you can increase your viewership, your membership by being controversial, because you will not only attract people that agree with your perspective, but you'll also attract the people that are there protesting. And for some people who are driven by an internal sense of their own importance, they don't care. There's one that's going on in the news right now about an influencer who used absolutely horrific racist language and immediately now is a talk show darling for the extreme right wing. But
Lovely.
The comment sections on Frank's videos show that division that I'm talking about. You see her behavior is called inappropriate by some, by actually a large portion of the viewers. And then there are others that advocate for extreme solutions for managing their children's behaviors. And those people just heaped praise on her. There are examples of this that have been talked about for years. In the case of the Duger family, 19 and growing, 20, 21, all that thing in itself is that they very strongly believed in a parenting system that's based on a book called How to Raise Up a Child, or How to Train Up a Child, and very, very bordering on abusive techniques. And unfortunately, it's not the only one. There are a lot of competitors out there writing books like that. So what I would offer as, a bit of an opinion here is there's an inherent narcissism in thinking that you're a parenting expert when you have no education. I get it, and I'll be the first to say I am not a parent, but it reminds me of an example. I was in a Starbucks down on Wilshire years ago, and I had gotten my MFT and I was finishing my doctorate, and I'd gotten at least one of my licenses. Maybe I wasn't licensed as a psychologist yet. And I don't know how the conversation started, but there was a very strange, extremely well-dressed woman at Starbucks standing next to me. Like, she reeked of money. Like, she had a lot of money, but she had the most sour ass expression on her face. And she asked me about what I did. I said, oh, well, I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist and I offer services in a private practice, but I'm finishing my doctoral work. And her first question was like, she whipped her head at me with this intense stare and said, do you have children?
Oh, man.
And I said, no, I don't. And then she just rolled her eyes, huffed, and turned away. And I remember thinking, this is not a time to waste any energy in arguing with someone that's clearly unable to regulate their own mouth. But, it's like saying to someone, like, you find out you have brain cancer, so you go to your specialist, and the first thing you ask that brain specialist is, have you had cancer? Have you had brain cancer? Well, then I don't trust your expertise. It's like, that's sort of the logic there. Makes no sense.
Happened all the time when I was on patrol, because when I was a cop, I didn't have a child yet, but there I was, in people's homes because they called the police because they couldn't get their kid up for school. And I had to go handle it. And sometimes I got the question, do you have kids? Do you know what this is like? Going, no, but I'm here and I handle these calls, so I'm going to help you out.
Well,
But
it's also, I mean, and that's a question that comes, I mean, those cases, the parent isn't under duress, and that is a stressful situation. I haven't had it with my own kid, but I have had it in other situations where it's like, what am I going to do in this situation? I'm going to drag you out of bed.
right.
I have no ability to do that. And certainly a parent, has to be very careful about any kind of physical interaction in
Yeah.
that when a kid's being a difficult teen or
Um,
younger.
just as a recommendation for our listeners, if you want to see a very clever YouTube video on the whole Mormon mommy influencer space, please go check out the YouTube channel Crooked Timber. So it's our friend Molly that used to be on Yeah No Yeah. They don't have that podcast anymore, but Molly is hilarious and so smart. And she does a ton of great videos on just interesting social and pop culture phenomenons. But she did one on mommy Mormons and like, why are they all so hot? Like it's just like her little teaser. It's so funny, but she just is like my kind of people. I love her dry sense of humor.
It's so great,
good.
but it's also exactly what I'm talking about. I wouldn't say, I mean, the hot is interesting because so many of them are, because that's a selling point, but they're also all standing in these completely featureless,
Yep.
boring, non-personal McMansion kitchens. Did they
Yes.
all move in, or are they all going, hey, is there a show house that I can use to film my videos? I don't know how that
It's
works, but it's so
really,
depersonalized.
really interesting. And fun fact I learned from her episode is that there's more plastic surgeons in Salt Lake City
Oh,
than
wow.
there are anywhere else in the country, including Los Angeles. But hearkening back to the Ruby Frank case, a lot of this social media presence has evolved from how they really, really influenced women in the LDS church to journal a lot about everything that was going on in their relationships. And that has now transitioned to reaching more people by being on social media. So when we go back and we hear about her social media channels, but also she was keeping these journals up, it really kind of dovetails. Anyway, back to her journals. She described the program as a quote intervention for the possessed. So we're looking at really her line of thinking here. So let's use this case example to look at delusional thinking, look at the different themes that we have here. So, number one, we have a belief in demonic possession. So, Frank believed her children were possessed by evil spirits, referring to them as even the spawns of Satan. And this belief led her to impose extreme and abusive measures, thinking that they were necessary to remove the evil from her children. And then that goes into misguided disciplinary methods. So, essentially stripping down a child's world to the basics of beans and rice and hard work, she justified these abusive actions by claiming that they were necessary for the prideful child. And this can be considered a delusion in that she felt that such harsh treatments were the only way to discipline and protect her children. So this one would be questionable among some parenting experts who favor these punitive measures, but nonetheless, it was getting attention. And, it makes me think, if they're starting to get attention, do they then like ramp up the ante to like keep getting more viewers, right? Keep getting people talking about it.
Yeah.
And then we have exposure to the elements for these kids. So on a hot day in July, Frank forced her children to work for hours in the sun and then poured old mop water over one child. She believed this was part of ridding them of evil, saying, quote, only demons stay in this shade, reflecting, really a distorted perception of discipline and punishment and her religiosity and where it had gotten to.
So again, going back to those overhanging porches and use of shade in a hot environment, one of the tools that Frank used was a cactus poker. She had pulled out a needle from a cactus, and when her children refused to stand in the sun, basically because they were being fried alive, she would use a cactus poker to force them back. And she was convinced that enduring physical pain would save them from the supposed heat of hell. So I would go so far as to say that this is a manifestation of persecutory delusions. So, and that is what she's experiencing of her own internalized view of her faith and what it means for her in the afterlife. All this is fascinating to me, continues to be even more fascinating because there's actually not a ton of information on her own background. I want to know everything about her family. I want to know everything about how she was raised. I want to know everything about how the husband hightailed it out of there,
Oh
all
my
of those
gosh.
things.
Yes.
But even more, the things of note that indicate this delusional process is that she also deprived them of food and water because she, in her belief system, viewed that the children's basic needs were privileges that they had to earn through confession and repentance. It's so fucking medieval. I mean, it's
Basic
just
needs. Come
crazy.
on.
She perceived their attempts to drink water as stealing, and then she imposed fasting on them as the quote is to use in her journal was to invite them to be humble. So clearly, those are examples of physical and psychological abuse. And one of the examples with her daughter, she put her daughter in a dog bath and shaved her head to remove quote unquote distractions. And she justified saying this, that all of her long hair is gone, no more distracting with hair. And
Wow.
again, you brought up a really good point earlier. Is this really who she is, or is this a basis of who she could be that is now motivated by the numbers that she's getting as validations from her online presence? I mean, you and I even talked about this in a previous episode long ago about a huge scandal on YouTube about the guy that had figured out the algorithm
Right.
of YouTube videos, and he was doing family things that were like cute skits and stuff. And then he realized in looking at all of the metrics that images of his kids being tied up in skits ranked really high, and then images of his like skits where his wife were tied up was really high. So he started having this change incrementally in how he presented his family that became more and more frightening because they would get him more views. Does that reflect who he is? Well, it certainly reflects like a really, really bad use of judgment or a
It's a
lack of judgment
horrible
at all.
moral compass.
It's a terrible moral compass. And also, I think there were also like he found out you could get a lot of watches or a lot of subscribers from scare videos where the kids appeared terrified. And then child services got involved. But I think that that's an example that Ruby Franke has taken to the extreme. And I do believe that like the viewers were there sort of validating her internal narcissism and grandiosity that she has this special relationship with the divine.
Yes, yes. I think it definitely fueled that. There were also repetitive punitive tasks. So the children were forced to perform repetitive, exhausting tasks, such as carrying boxes up and down stairs, to instill a sense of hard work and punishment.
Oof.
Franke believed that good work needs to be painful, further reflecting her delusional thinking. Whether she was aware of it or not, this technique is known as a torture technique to break down individuals. Records, of Nazi Germany's concentration camps show that prisoners were forced to do repetitive and unnecessary tasks, such as moving piles of rocks from one location to another and then back again. If a task, even if you're in like a legit prison, it has a means to an end or you're doing it for a reason, people can find meaning and purpose in that, even if they're just a prisoner, right? But these are psychologically so unnecessary. And that's the piece that we're talking about that will lend to breaking somebody down.
Well, now I before my veterans kick in and make comment, I want to also say that this is a technique that is used in military basic training.
Sure.
Not always, but the grunts know why they're doing it. They know what the purpose of it is. It's meant to be annoying. It's not meant to necessarily be torture, although it can be torture us, but you're part of a military organization. Now, I'm not a military expert. Psychologically, I don't think that that's particularly helpful, but if that's something that a military psychologist has more information on than I do, then I welcome to have that. But
it's meant to build resilience, not to
break
just
someone
do it to
down.
torture someone.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. And I have who's become a really good friend at the department where I work, an officer who suffered multiple gunshot wounds a year ago. And he was a guy that before this already overachiever, in his 50s, does Ironmans and just pushes his body like crazy. And he said, in those moments where I was shot and I couldn't lift my arm and I'm trying to escape, this confined space where the suspect was shooting at him, he's like, I knew that, like, okay, I just need to concentrate on the mental piece because my physical body, I have pushed that to the absolute limit.
Yeah.
And I know I'm going to get through this. And so he kind of harkens back to the ways in which he has challenged himself physically. And that really helped him get through this situation. So it's, I think, God, why would anybody want to do an Ironman, or why does anyone want to train or run harder at the end when they're completely exhausted? But it's this to know that you can do it and you can survive.
Oh, yeah.
So
I completely respect that. Yeah.
That's all of that to say that's very different than what she's doing here, or that we've seen in other sort of instances of torture. This other technique that she used was one of isolation and time distortion. So the children were often isolated, causing them to lose complete track of time. And when Franke realized her son knew his birthday had passed, she saw this as a failure in her control over him. So she considered the children's attempts to keep track of days as evidence of their delusions, projecting her own irrational beliefs onto them. And again, we know this from prisoners of war. If you can at least kind of make some sense of what day it is or how much time has passed, it's so important to keeping them grounded.
Very interesting too. Hopefully this will come out as more research emerges to see if she sought out information like this, if she was given information by Hildebrandt, or if it was just sort of an organic emergence
making it
from
up
her
as you
own.
go.
Yeah, just making it up as she goes along. So it also extended into physical restraint and confinement. So restraining the children in closets as well as with ropes and handcuffs is completely just completely not heard of. The only time you would ever do this is if the child's behaviors coming from more likely an organic disorder, such as like severe autism, and the child is engaging in behaviors where they're hurting themselves. So they're engaging in headbanging. That's really the only time that you would use these kind of restraints. But she described her actions as necessary to prevent escape, of course, because you want to keep doing it, and then to also prevent further demonic behaviors. So she's really now over time just disconnecting from reality and has no insight. I think I even said before we started recording, when you and I were kind of talking over things, one of the things to me that is significant is if you look at her earlier, and everything's been taken down now, but you can find a lot of the recordings on Reddit. She was kind of typically bouncy and smiley, petite, blonde, fresh-faced, well-groomed, wonderful hygiene, high energy, little bits hypomanic to me. But then as it progressed and as she became more fixated on her, spawn of Satan children, her affect gets more rigid and less of an emotional range and more sour and threatening in my perspective, just like watching it. And then finally, the big one, I think that was a main driver here in that delusional belief system is, again, her religiosity and feeling that she has a special connection to divinity and feeling that she has special abilities. So again, she's not hearing things, she's not seeing things, she's not having physical feelings of things, she's not smelling things that aren't there, but she feels that she has this ability to communicate with God. And after finding her kid that has attempted to escape during one previous attempt, she described it in her journals as a miracle and believed that divine intervention had helped her find him right before the dawn. So something happens. She's already got a twisted, deluded belief system. So then confirmation bias in her part really concretizes or sets into her belief system that she's on her righteous mission.
Well, and that's the difference between a case like this, where you have that grandiosity piece of the delusion, where she believes, she is such a super mom that God sent her these children, right? These possessed children, as opposed to Andrea Yates, who, was so psychotic and ill and thought her children were possessed that she had to kill them in order to
She had to
save them.
rescue them from their own evil or the
Right.
potential for evil. Yeah.
So here Frank is like, oh, no, but I can do this and God has tasked me with this. Frank later stated in open court, quote, I was so disoriented that I believed dark was light and right was wrong. So she pleaded guilty to starving and abusing her children, and Frank was jailed for 4 terms of 1 to 15 years each. Jody Hildebrandt also pleaded guilty and received the same sentence. What continues to be mystifying is actually how long it took for legal action to emerge. I mean, especially with Frank being highly
It's right
criticized
there.
online. It's for the world to see, literally.
Yeah.
This is not just happening behind closed doors, but yeah, criticized for her parenting style that really then had this weird bolstering of attention. Interestingly, Frank's lawyers attempted a plea deal and attempted to pin the blame for the child abuse all on Hildebrandt, who ran the Connections classroom. That's Connections with an X. And that was a parenting workshop. And they described Frank as a devoted mother who ended up in this situation because of Hildebrandt's influence.
A very interesting report, too, is that when Frank was arrested, and for several weeks after her arrest, she was obsessed with Hildebrandt. Like, where is she? Like,
Yep.
what's going on with her? Is there any way for me to contact her? Can I talk? And she was concerned about her safety too. So very much Folie do. And although we are focusing on Frank for this particular episode, Hildebrandt in multiple interviews still she was not backing down at all. She was saying that this is my divine mission on earth, is that there are so many satanic children. And she's very much into a number of other conspiracy theories that we won't even go into now. I'm sure as more comes out, maybe we'll even do another update in a couple of years to see what happens with these people. But this is one of the things that we'll talk about in treatment interventions a little bit later, is that you definitely separate the two to break that influence. In that court hearing process, there's a quote that's very interesting to me, and it says, Ms. Hildebrandt systematically isolated Ruby Frank from her extended family, older children, and her husband, Kevin Frank. This prolonged isolation resulted in Ms. Frank being subjected to a distorted sense of morality shaped by Ms. Hildebrandt's influence. Her behavior presents several signs of delusional thinking, or at minimum altered thinking. So again, as I was saying earlier, extreme and harmful parenting practices that include systematic starvation, restraints, and unaddressed wounds, that indicates a significant break from reality. Just as an example, like, I know that it is really on the fringe and of hooeydom, particularly, what's it called? What's the word for the medicine? Homeopathic medicine, right? So, I mean, the science behind it is just so bizarre, even with my woo-woo beliefs. I will say this, I use an anti-inflammatory Arnica montana, which is a homeopathic. I love it. It may be complete placebo effect, but it works for me.
Which there is a lot of research behind. So there you go.
Exactly. So there is research behind placebo effect. But if my leg is cut open, which her children's were, her son had open wounds on his legs.
Right.
She put duct tape on them, not even bandages. She put duct tape on them and gave him homeopathic topical treatment. That's not what you do for somebody whose system, as an emaciated child, he's already going to have an impaired repair system as far as healing is concerned. So just a real clear, distorted view of right and wrong. So Frank's actions and her words indicate that she was really caught up in some pretty extreme and paranoid thoughts. I don't think she was necessarily paranoid about her own safety, but then there is a layer that we have to talk about culturally that happens with Mormons, and Mormons do have a very, very important aspect of their belief system, which is their immortality. And their immortality, if they are good Mormons on this planet,
right,
in the afterlife, they become the god and goddess of their own planet, populating that planet with billions and billions of souls throughout history. It's a very interesting belief system. I'm not going to really comment on that except to juxtapose it against, if Frank is a true believer of the Mormon faith, then she probably would be paranoid to an extent about what her role is and what she's supposed to do to protect her children. But we're going to have an overlap of that talking about the Daybed example as well. So she thought that her harsh methods were the only way to properly discipline her kids and protect them from what she saw as the bad effects of modern parenting. Even though there's a lot of evidence showing that she was wrong, she had a fixed belief. She dug her heels in and she stuck to those no matter what. And that is absolutely a dovetail with delusional disorder.
Yeah. So who do you think was the primary person in this case? Yeah. Yeah.
Hildebrandt's
so
very, very much. But that's not to indicate that Frank was passive at all.
No.
Not at all.
No, that doesn't have to be the case. And after Frank got arrested and went through her trial, the terrible impact of what she did became really clear. Her estranged husband, Kevin, made it known that he had been living apart from her for over a year and had nothing to do with the abuse. He went on to file for divorce and pushed for Ruby to get the harshest sentence possible, calling her actions horrific and inhumane. An important factor to note is that immediately following the arrest, Frank's eldest daughter and her sisters revealed that they had been trying to raise concerns about Ruby's behavior for years. So I know he says he lived apart from her for a year, but this did not just happen within a year.
And when it comes to, and I'm not making any excuses for Kevin Frank because part of me just wants to go, where the fuck were you?
Yeah.
But I'm going to admit that there were things that we don't have evidence about. This may have been developing for years. The thing that doesn't really fit into that model, though, is that when you look at the age of the youngest child, it's like you continued to have children with someone who was displaying these behaviors. Or maybe, it's possible that she displayed none of this. Maybe she was just a good Mormon mom until things got weird with Hildebrand. I mean, there's really... There also appears to be like not only an enmeshment, but like a psychosexual thing that seems to be happening with Frank and Hildebrand that was very interesting to me. But the big thing here is that we put so much emphasis in our culture on believe the children, believe the children, believe the children. And here were these two young women or girls, basically, when they were minors, they knew shit was going down and there's no record. Now, if anybody has any evidence from, the citizen detective work on Reddit, that there were police going out there and, trying to get answers, I would love to know about that. But
gosh,
again, going back to some of the newest research about the brain imaging, again, shows that there are abnormalities in that area we're talking about in the prefrontal cortex. And that is, just to give you an example, visually, the prefrontal cortex is located right at the front part of your brain, just behind your forehead. And this is the area that helps you with decision-making, planning, controlling your behavior. We think of it as the brain's control center, and it helps you think through things and stay focused. And it's also, you don't ever want to get a traumatic brain injury, believe me. You don't want to get conked at all. You don't want a concussion. It's just, we know now that like jiggling around that big blob of jello in your skull, not a good thing. But injury to the front of the forehead can often result in major changes in behavior. So it's understandable that if there's a genetic predisposition, something weird going on there, that this is why someone could fall prey to delusional thinking and delusional behaviors.
Yeah. And just to be clear, the brain abnormalities that we're talking about in this region are being backed up by this brain imaging in individuals with delusional disorder. So this is also the area of the brain that's responsible for decision-making, problem-solving, planning, impulse control, as well as regulating your social behavior. And it's divided into several subregions, and each of those have specialized functions like your working memory or your executive function or emotional regulation and then decision-making. So in contrast, Folie Deux is clearly a result of strong influence of one individual, a true believer, right? And we've talked about true believers in all sorts of contexts in our podcast, especially when we're looking at extremist ideologies, incredibly powerful, as we have seen it take over half of our country,
Yeah.
what feels like at times, but also just think about it between just two people who are sharing true emotional intimacy and beliefs. And it's influential of that secondary individual who is really likely motivated by a need for connection. And that second person might not have any mental health issues on their own, but starts to believe in the delusions because of their close relationship with the first person, who does usually have some underlying mental health problems that make them prone to delusions and whatever manifestation that is.
What we're talking about there is brain structure, whether it's organic, whether there may have been an injury, a stroke, car accident, which is actually delusional disorder, or major symptoms for this can actually arise from traumatic brain injury as well. But what are the contributing factors? So it's a mix. It's genetic, it's biological, it's environmental. But one of the big ones is if there's a family history of psychotic disorders, that greatly, greatly increases the risk. Structural differences in the brain, like we've talked about, or chemical imbalances, especially involving dopamine. And dopamine is so valuable for us getting through the day, like little dopamine drops that we get from exercise, from a good interaction with people, from finishing a task. But that doesn't mean that you can just fix things mood-wise by increasing dopamine. It doesn't work that way. All of our neurochemicals have to be very carefully balanced within our brains. And what they found is that too much dopamine can really push the brain into a state where it's open to psychosis. But life stressors like trauma, isolation, and other major changes can trigger the disorder. Now, people who tend to be suspicious or very rigid in their thinking are way more likely to develop delusional beliefs. So, are they suspicious and rigid in their thinking because they have an organic brain issue? That's what has yet to be determined. So, understanding these factors and how those interplay will really help create effective treatment plans that address all the aspects of the disorder. A big one, social isolation, is another big factor, because those that feel disconnected are way more susceptible to adopting delusions or integrating delusions from a dominant figure in their life, whether that person is actually there, or it's somebody they're watching on the TV, or it's a newscaster on a weirdo channel that they're listening to all the time.
Or a YouTube channel.
Exactly. Or stress, like high levels of stress trigger mental health issues and make individuals way more vulnerable to adopting these kind of delusions. So the primary treatment, as we've referred to, for shared psychotic disorder, first and foremost, is to separate those individuals involved. You have to separate them. This was definitely and immediately done in the case of the Slenderman perpetrators, because of their children, of course. And then apparently it was done even for Ruby Franke and Jody Hildebrand. And then if the delusions persist after that separation in a period of time, then antipsychotic medications and therapy are employed. Antipsychotics can reduce delusions, and they're particularly useful in the short term. However, this is a big one that I really want to nail down for people with psychotic disorders. Even shared psychotic disorders have very limited insight into the fact that there's something wrong with them.
Right.
And they're relatively high functioning in other areas. Like, I'm a successful businesswoman. Look at me. I've got millions of viewers.
Mm-hmm.
How can you possibly tell me there's something wrong with me?
Yeah. Hard to argue with that if you're just standing on that side, looking from that perspective.
Right.
So as far as treatment goes, dealing with delusional disorder can be tricky because people with it are often suspicious by nature, right? And have false beliefs. So again, kind of getting them even into therapy, as we've talked about before, is tricky, or it's usually something else that brings them there, perhaps a relationship issue, or they will come in because of the anxiety of the false belief is really impacting their daily functioning. So they're not there to have their belief challenged. They're there to figure out how the heck you can help them because they're feeling so bad. So that, I think that's probably one of the most common types of presentations when someone self-refers. Research shows that using therapy together with antipsychotic medication is the best approach when you are treating the delusion. Therapy helps tackle the root problems and reduce the symptoms, while the medication can help manage the delusions and inappropriate behaviors. So I think with other psychotic disorders that you've used the example, Scott, that it's kind of the medication is like turning down the dial a bit on some of the auditory or visual hallucinations. And in this case, it's turning down the dial on the false beliefs.
Exactly.
And therapy are really essential to have a beneficial, successful treatment in this case. One of the most important ones, of course, with all therapists, but is just building that trust in the beginning. It's really crucial for therapists to create a trusting and supportive relationship with the client, and probably more so hinders on how successful the rest of treatment will be when we're talking about building trust in a delusional disorder treatment program or protocol. And then boosting confidence is something that would also follow as far as just what the therapist has in mind as far as their treatment goals. Therapists work on increasing the client's self-esteem in this case and gently challenging their delusions if it's appropriate to do so, when it's appropriate to do so. And then especially, as we briefly mentioned before, if you're going to introduce cognitive behavioral therapy, you are gradually changing these thought patterns and replacing them, right? And kind of bringing some of the factual information to the surface. Again, this is very slow going. This is not session number one where you're going to challenge their delusional thoughts, but once you start undergoing a lot of CBT techniques. But just the medication effectiveness, I mean, there's varied responses there. When we look at the research, about a third of patients see some improvement. Another third don't notice much change or worsen. And the last third in the research studies don't take the medication as prescribed. So it can't really be parsed out either way if it was effective. And medications like Haldol and Risperdal can help control the agitation and inappropriate behaviors linked to delusional thoughts. Jumping back to CBT for a second, cognitive behavioral therapy, we know that this is a really well-searched method for treating people with all sorts of disorders, but that includes delusional disorder. And like I said, the first step is building that trust, because they fear that they're not going to be believed. Again, in CBT, that trust at the beginning is so important because the patients don't often trust professionals or don't think they're going to be believed. But aside from the thought-changing techniques that we talked about earlier, you really want to encourage participation from the clients, have them get involved in activities that reduce the impact of their delusions. So you have that behavioral component. And then, of course, family therapy can also help provide support, but continue to dismantle the delusional belief system. So it's well-rounded. It takes a lot of time.
A lot.
Sometimes CBT can be really quick and easy courses of therapy with people that you're just looking at maybe reducing a problematic behavior. And you do work with the thoughts, but this one is so heavily thought-based that it's going to be a longer term of therapy for sure.
Yeah, I think you hit on something that's so important in the basis of therapeutic treatment, whether regardless of the education, licensure, or orientation of the clinician, it's about a relationship. And you can have the best tools, you can have the best interventions, but if you as a clinician are not able, and this is where the art comes in therapy, if you're not able to establish a working, safe, nurturing, therapeutic alliance with your client, then you're really going to be up against a wall about accomplishing anything. So yeah, everything is based on that relationship, regardless of what the orientation is.
Right. So moving on to our next case example here, you heard us talk about one half of the doomsday cult murdering couple, Lori Vallow, when we reviewed the documentary Sins of Our Mother back in episode 129. So here we go, focusing more on the other half today, Chad Daybed. And Chads don't have a great track record on our podcast. But with that is
so true.
let's learn a little bit about Chad's background before we go into really just the events in this really horrific case that unfortunately mimics a lot of Ruby Franke's case, but ended up in a much worse situation. Before any of the criminal aspects happened here, Chad Daybell had a relatively low profile and was primarily known as an author and publisher within the Latter-day Saints community. Chad was born on August 11th, 1968 in Provo, Utah, and he attended Brigham Young University, where he graduated with a degree in journalism. And after college, he worked as a cemetery sexton. So this is someone who manages and maintains a cemetery, which interestingly influenced his interest in the afterlife and near-death experiences. So he went on to found Spring Creek Book Company, where he published many of his own books, as well as books by other LDS authors. And his numerous books focused on LDS themes, the end times, his own alleged near-death experiences as well. And his writings often revolved around apocalyptic scenarios and spiritual visions. And this is the first time that I've really been like, I'm kind of getting L. Ron Hubbard vibes here.
Right. Is that Chad Daybell was a true believer.
True. I totally picking up what you're putting down.
Yeah.
But through his writings, he developed quite the following among some members of the LDS community who were really interested in his interpretations of the end times and other, big spiritual matters. So Chad married a woman named Tammy Douglas in 1990, and they had 5 children together. Were together for quite a long time. And then fast forward way up to 2018, Chad meets Lori Vallow, who shared his interest in these apocalyptic beliefs. And when he connected with Lori, the religious beliefs became even more extreme than they had been. Touch on that more in a second, just to see what those themes are. But first, let's get into the timeline of this case and really lay it out. For me, it's always extremely confusing, this timeline. I'm glad we've covered it before when we did talk about Lori. But, there's a lot of back and forth. There's a lot of players here. There's a lot of deaths, which make this really confusing. So I think just even if someone's just kind of coming to this for a refresher or review, it's good to cover this.
So just to understand a little bit about Lori Vallow Daybell, when she and Chad got together, she was a 50-year-old woman. She had a daughter, Tylee Ryan, from a previous relationship when she married Charles Vallow, her 4th husband, in 2006. In 2012, she and Charles adopted then 2-year-old Joshua, whose biological father was Vallow's nephew. Joshua, who was also known as JJ, was on the ASD spectrum, and he and his sister Tylee were extremely close. It was clear that these 2 kids were just beloved by the family and everyone around them, and their relationship was very, very tight. And if you want to get more of Lori's background, feel free to listen to episode 128 or watch the documentary entitled Sins of Our Mothers. It is a wild ride. In September 2019, Lori had appeared on a podcast with Chad Daybell, and she made an effort to move closer to him by relocating her kids to Rexburg, Idaho. Lori's brother, Alex Cox, was also a Chad Daybell follower and moved into the same apartment complex. September 8th, 2019, Tylee, her daughter that we were talking about, is missing. She's not seen anymore. She's not heard from by her friends or family. And the morning after Tylee disappears, investigators say that Alex Cox's cell phone pinged in Chad Daybell's backyard on the property for about 2 hours. And very strangely, after Cox's GPS showed him leaving the property, Chad Daybell texted his wife, Tammy Daybell, and the text read, quote, "I spotted a big raccoon along the fence. I hurried and got my gun, and he was still walking along. I got close enough that one shot did the trick. He is now in our pet cemetery," close quote. Very, very, very strange, because in an area like this, why would you be concerned about shooting a raccoon? Makes no sense at all.
Right.
It does make sense once all these factors have come together to justify this timeline. Then moving on to September 22nd, 2019, JJ Vallow was last seen. A witness to the case named Melanie Gibbs said that she and her boyfriend, David Warwick, were staying with Lori Vallow in Rexburg over the weekend. And on the night of September 22nd, Warwick says he saw Alex Cox carry JJ into Lori's apartment. So let me just go back because I know I'm talking fast. Warwick says that he saw Alex Cox. Alex Cox is Lori Vallow's brother, carrying JJ, their autistic son, adopted son, into Lori's apartment. But the next morning, according to Warwick, when he asked to see JJ, Lori repeatedly told him that JJ was, quote unquote, being a zombie and that Cox had taken him away. The day after JJ was last seen, Alex's cell phone showed that he returned to Chad Daybell's backyard.
Yeah. So let's just take a little break from the timeline to talk about the real strange themes and cornerstones of their beliefs. Again, you can get much more thorough overview in a lot of places, including our other previous episodes. But they were increasingly convinced that doomsday was just around the corner. As a part of that belief, both Lori and Chad said that people's bodies were possessed by evil spirits and then turning them into zombies. And a lot of this is from people around them who are witnesses that were hearing them talk like this, as well as being pulled from text messages between the two of them eventually. So they included that JJ and Tylee had been, at least at some point, possessed by evil spirits. And then once they turn into zombies, it's like the point of no return. They have to essentially do away with them, is what came to light. They also believed this about Charles Vallow, who was Lori's fourth husband. Lori specifically said that part of her mission on Earth was to eliminate the darkness, the demonic, and the evil. So again, very much hearkening back to Ruby Franke and some of her beliefs, just of this grandiosity piece of the delusion. And she and Chad really thought that they were chosen to lead the very specific 144,000 people who would survive the end of times. And Charles Vallow, her previous husband, had even told police, look, she's at a point where she believes that she's a resurrected being and she is now a god. So imagine just the power that comes with that belief. They had some interesting other things that came out in their text messages that, you know, once investigators were sort of able to put two and two together. And I think even in the documentary, some other folks have talked about how Chad had talked about this to them, but where they had this rating scale for people in their lives. Yeah, for light to dark, of how close people were to becoming zombies or not, if they could be saved, if not, if they had to be killed or what have you. So yeah, they would refer to people as numbers essentially on this rating scale. But the text messages between the two of them just really included a number of other religious elements, including the use of names James and Elena for themselves. And this was the names that they thought were used for them as a couple in a previous past life. And one of the things that Chad Daybell first said when he really met Lori, he told her, we have been married in a past life before. And that was kind of one of those moments where she was just really sort of sucked in by him. So in October of 2019, less than a month later from these children going missing, Chad's wife, Tammy Daybell, dies. The couple's son, Garth Daybell, who was an adult, said that Tammy died in bed and that he and Chad had actually called 911. It was ruled natural causes because she had been in poor health prior to her death, and their adult children were the ones that decided that an autopsy was not necessary because they knew that she had been ill. And then November 5th, 2019, about 2 weeks later from Tammy's passing, with Lori's children still missing and Chad's wife now dead, Lori and Chad go off to picturesque Hawaii and get married on a beach with, I mean, they had a photographer and everything. They got big old smiles on their faces. They are in wedded bliss in these pictures. Just, you would think, happiest couple in the world and nothing is going wrong in their life.
It's
but the
really
backdrop,
disconcerting. It's really disconcerting. The sort of really verging on psychotic way they're smiling at each other after these losses. Your children are gone, your wife is dead. Just like all of these things are so disturbing, especially, we look at, the background that you provided about Chad having worked in the funeral system. And also, like, let's frame it within a context of what's been happening for the past 15 years on television that has been sort of a cultural movement in entertainment.
Zombies.
The Walking Dead, zombies, right? It's in The Walking Dead inspired at least one other successful show called Z Nation and several movies and other kind of knockoff television shows that didn't really work, but all about this rebirth.
Yep.
So rebirth, but the idea also to talk about something that's really disturbing about this is just how quickly they jumped into their relationship and the narcissism of thinking that it would be, even if you do have this religious belief and that you're engaging in ridding the zombies, like to not have the insight about how it would look to the world at large.
Oh, they were completely in their delusion. Like, this is all part of God's plan and these people are dead and we can now, go get married and be in charge of the afterlife for everyone.
Right. So later that month, after the blissful wedding, JJ's grandmother asked police to check on JJ's welfare. So she hasn't heard anything from the kids in months. She knows how close Tylee and JJ are. So the Rexburg police went to Lori Vallow Daybell's apartment, and Lori, now back in Idaho, told them that JJ was safe and staying in Arizona with her friend, which then her friend denied to police when she was contacted. So now a nationwide search for the children has followed. Also, let's now go back in December 19th to Chad and Lori going back to Hawaii. And at this point, the Fremont County Sheriff's investigators are really getting suspicious about Tammy Daybell's death. And they exhume her body to conduct an autopsy. And then in another strange twist, that very same month, Lori's brother Alex died in Arizona. And it was determined that he died of quote unquote natural causes, which was all the indicators show that he killed himself just because he may very well have realized, like, he starts to have some little insight into the fact that he's being completely used by these two delusional people and the shit's going to come down on him. Yeah. In January 2020, authorities go on to serve Lori Vallow Daybell an order requiring her to produce her children. And then after she failed to comply, she was arrested in Hawaii and extradited back to Idaho. Now, June 9th, 2020, so we're going from January to June, the couple are still refusing to say where the children are. The FBI, Rexburg Police, and the Fremont County Sheriff's Office all descend on Chad Daybell's home and property. And authorities conduct this search in his backyard where Alex Cox's cell phone had pinged in September 2019. And they finally uncover human remains buried in shallow graves. Later, from forensic testing, they determined those bodies' remains to be Tylee and JJ. At that point, Chad was arrested as well as he's driving down the freeway at high speed to get away from them because he realizes he's been found out.
Like, I better leave this property while they're doing a search and try to get away. So Lori was tried separately, and first she was sentenced to life without parole after an Idaho jury found her guilty in May of 2023 on all charges for her role in the deaths of Tylee and JJ. She has since been extradited to now Arizona, where she faces 2 charges of conspiracy to commit murder in the death of her husband, Charles. So Charles was murdered, shot by Lori's now deceased brother, Alex, as well as she is facing charges in the case of Brandon Boudreaux, who is the ex-husband of her niece, who had an attempt on his life. Alex Cox shot at him outside of his own home as well. So that, again, like adding more complicated issues to the story and other deaths. But fortunately, Brandon survived. He testified against her and then will be, obviously a surviving victim in the charges in Arizona. So Chad Daybell ended up getting charged with first-degree murder for the deaths of JJ and Tylee. And he was also charged with murdering his first wife, Tammy Daybell. After they completed the autopsy, they realized this was in fact a murder. And in May of this year, just a matter of weeks ago, Chad Daybell was convicted on all counts. Daybell's 5 adult children have stood by him this whole time, completely believe in his innocence. They maintain that it was Lori and Alex who conspired and carried out these murders and framed Chad. They even say that, his experience working in a cemetery would have never allowed or would have never dug such shallow graves. What a thing to say. I mean,
well, he wasn't the one that dug them. Alex was.
I know, obviously.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, here we are again, 2 people seemingly feeding off one another with the delusional beliefs that, with these very strong religious themes, led them to be absolute monsters to the people closest to them in their lives. I mean, your own children.
Yeah. And then the extension of that is looking at Chad's adult children. I get it. I mean, let me tell you, I get it when someone that you care about, that you love, has been accused of something absolutely horrific. And there are so many situations. Maybe some people are being framed. I mean,
Right.
that there certainly has been evidence of that. But you look at what you have to sacrifice in order to look at incontrovertible evidence.
Yeah.
And that's a lot. You have to sacrifice your belief in your relative or your loved one. And then that also shakes the foundation of who you are as a person. We have evidence of this. We have people who are the children of serial killers who have come forward to talk about how it ultimately and inevitably changed their internal view of themselves and their internal experience of life, because they understand that so much of what they lived was a lie.
Yeah.
So I get it. I get that people can dig in, but there's also a reason why people dig in so much, is because they can also live in this bubble or an echo chamber of religiosity. And there is a correlation between delusional disorder and extremely high religiosity. So researchers in the publication Science Direct indicate that a very high level of religiosity can intersect with delusional disorder in really complex ways. And studies in this area have found that religious themes are very common in delusions in people with psychotic disorders. Of course it would be, because it's going to feel supernatural to hear things, see things, believe things, or just have the delusional belief. It feels like a completely altered experience, and it feels completely real. And with between 20 and 60% of delusions containing religious content, you can understand how this would be so prevalent. So this suggests a significant overlap, although, again, the exact nature of the relationship is nuanced. So if you were to live in a completely non-religious society, or you were raised in a household with no context, maybe that delusion would be then more fixated on government conspiracies or whoever is holding power, right? So researchers from Georgetown's Berkeley Center also go on to say that a possible reason for this correlation is that delusional individuals can interpret religious experiences through the lens of their delusion. So as an example, somebody with a delusional disorder might believe, like Daybell, like Lori, like Franke, have a special mission from a deity, or that they themselves are being persecuted by supernatural forces. So that interpretation, that particular personal experience, can then be intensified in really highly religious environments where spiritual experiences and beliefs are central to their lifestyle. So the social dynamics within religious communities can support, or they can aggravate, delusional beliefs. So a supportive community might provide comfort and help to down-regulate that stress, which is making the delusions worse. And then that might potentially reduce the intensity of delusions. On the other hand, a community that reinforces extreme beliefs or stigmatizes mental illness can actually just make the individual's condition a lot worse. So with all these considerations, the individual's background and personality are a huge factor in delusional disorder and folie à deux. Those with a familial predisposition to psychosis can find that their delusional content is influenced by their religious environment. But again, it's not a one-size-fits-all situation. Every one of these cases has to be examined and evaluated with a very, very nuanced understanding of this very much complex interplay between social, personal, and cultural factors.
Yeah, let's hope these are the last cases like this for a while. I mean, just to be inundated with, several that seems like they've been happening in recent times. I don't know how much hope I have for that, but the theme with all of these is they involve children in one way or another.
Right. And there's so much
so
fear
hard.
involved. I remember one of the court examples from Slenderman was that the girls believed that Slenderman was going to come and kill their families. Somehow they had gotten that belief that if
Yeah.
they did not offer this sacrifice, and the sacrifice would benefit them because they would become supernaturally powered in
Yeah.
Slenderman's forest. But if they didn't do it, he was going to come after their families. So,
Right.
you
So it
know,
wasn't just like, oh, you get to go to a magic castle and kill someone.
right.
Like there was this other fear component to it. Sure.
Right. And then, I mean, when we talk about religiosity, these individuals really do have this belief that these are zombies. I mean, Chad Daybed, it is very convincing. I mean, he does have this sort of jocular manner in his conferences. Like you watch these conferences on YouTube and he's saying, I know this is controversial, but let me tell you what's actually happening out there, folks. I'm not writing fiction. I'm actually writing dramatized versions of what's going to happen. And people ate it up.
Okay, L. Ron Hubbard. So we're not going to cover entertainment depictions. If you want, we covered quite a few in the previous episode 28. If you want to add some of those to your list, we did an episode of X-Files where we talked about Mulder kind of getting into a Folie, Deux, and the episode name is Folie, Deux. Of course, the movie Bug that we referenced today, and then Heavenly Creatures, which definitely add that to your list. But, this had me wondering, I wonder how many of our listeners go and watch these that we talk about. I mean, can you imagine the list that we've made after 185 episodes?
It is. It's a lot. I'm a huge fan of Heavenly Creatures. I remember finding dissertations that had been written about that movie that were
That's
so
cool.
good. Yeah.
Very cool. So in closing, remember that we'll be appearing at CrimeCon UK, the ultimate true crime event. It returns to London on September 21st and 22nd. That's less than 100 days away. CrimeCon UK is the world's leading true crime event and is partnered by True Crime, the expert-led channel that was previously known as CBS Reality, available on your platform of choice.
I'm so excited. I'm already dieting down because there's going to be unlimited biscuits available. I'm very excited.
Give Dr. Scott all the biscuits so he doesn't get hangry at the table. I always pack him snacks. So,
yes, we know it's necessary. So if you can join us, please use the code confidential for your special 10% discount. The more of our listeners that use our code, the more it helps us pay for the trip and accommodations. So please don't forget to use the confidential code for 10% off. Head to crimecon.co.uk to book your tickets today.
And I will put a link to that in the show notes, as well as a link that we'll just keep these up, but also for Josh Hallmark's Berkshire's Podcast Festival, which we will be at in October. And we should be getting some details about what we'll be doing soon for that. So we will relay that to you guys. But with that, thank you so much for revisiting Folie, Deux with us and delusional disorder yet again. Always super interesting. And we will try to do this as necessary with old topics. If there's any out there that you would like an update on, I know we did, obviously, our first episode back when we came back from our hiatus was on some small little updates, but always happy to pull some research for bigger updates. Let us know. Everyone, we'll see you next time on LA
Not So
Confidential. Bye, guys.
Bye, folks. See you next time.
We sincerely thank you for spending some time with us today. LA Not So Confidential is part of the Crawlspace Media Network. Each episode is hosted, produced, and written by Dr. Scott and Dr. Shiloh. Our post-production editing and sweetening magic is handled by the multi-talented Jason Usry of Ear Cult Productions.
Our theme music, entitled Cool Vibes Film Noir, is composed and performed by the talented Kevin MacLeod. He graciously allows us to use his music via a Creative Commons Attribution license. Please check out all of Kevin's amazing work on YouTube.
All of the resources for each episode can be found on our website at la-not-so-confidential.com. You can find us on Instagram at LA Not So Podcast, on X at LA Not So Pod, and on Facebook at LA Not So Confidential. Media inquiries and bookings are scheduled at alienistentertainment@gmail.com.
Once a month, we go live on YouTube on Saturday afternoon. So pay attention to our social media announcements to join our interactive broadcast entitled Behind the Couch, where we interview guests on a number of psych, criminal justice, and true crime topics.
And lastly, we'd be honored if you joined our Patreon at patreon.com/LA Not So Podcast. With a subscription, you get an ad-free listening experience, additional content, host interaction, and you'll be the first to know about upcoming live events, social gatherings, and super cool swag.
Thanks for listening, and join us next time on LA
Not So
Confidential.